Good evening, everyone. I wanted to warmly welcome you to the fourth edition of the Digital Cultures Festival. The topic of this year's festival is Imagined Futures. The festival is organized by the Adam Mickiewicz Institute, and this is the last conversation of this year's festival. My name is Alek Tarkowski, and I wanted to warmly welcome Dr. Charlotte Webb, with whom I will be talking. To quickly just say a few words about Charlotte, who has many roles and does a lot of interesting things. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Arts London, where she works at the Creative Computing Institute. She's also the co-founder and chief leopard of the Feminist Internet, and finally a founding director of even a ethical tech consultancy. So Charlotte wears a lot of hats, but her work focuses on looking for alternatives to how technology is being built and used. And this is the topic of her talk and also of our conversation afterwards. Some housekeeping. We would like to extend an invitation for you to participate in this conversation. So first of all, if you share any thoughts or comments or questions on chat of whichever channel you're using to view this conversation, these will be shared by us, and Charlotte can in particular respond to any questions you have. There's also a more advanced option. If you want to join us on Zoom, you can do so. And then you will be able to speak directly with us. So if you'd like to join us on Zoom, you need to go to digitalcultures.pl program and find our event and click the join button, which will transport you magically into our conversation, so to say. But if that's too complicated, you can simply chat with us on YouTube or any other channel where you are watching us. So this is the housekeeping, and I think that without further ado, we can start Charlotte's lecture, which has been pre-recorded and also made a lot more wonderful by animation prepared by Marta Lisowska. And once the video finishes, we'll be back with Charlotte and start our conversation.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope that you've had a fantastic conference so far. I am one of the co-founders of Feminist Internet, and we are a non-profit collective, and our aim is to disrupt inequalities in internet products and services by equipping and educating the people who build them and the people who use them. And we do this by bringing together technology, art and design, feminism, and creative practice in workshops, in events, in creative product development and consultancy. And since we began in 2017, we have worked with NGOs, with universities, with corporations, and other cultural institutions all around the world. And we have created a podcast, we've created some chatbots, and we've prototyped dozens of speculative technologies with particularly young people who really want to reimagine technologies that exist today. But the most amazing thing about Feminist Internet for me is the people in the collective and the way that we're able to navigate what can sometimes be really, really challenging terrain. And it's that collective dynamic that I think makes it possible to address social injustices and to imagine better futures. So I wanted to start today with a question for you. What do the internet and the pandemic have in common? And I'm sure that having been at this conference for a few days, you have some idea already about what I'm going to say. But I really think that both expose and amplify structural social inequalities. Coronavirus is a bit like a dye that shows up stains on teeth, or a sort of infrared light that shows up the fingerprints of injustice. In terms of the pandemic, women and girls face specific complications because of historical and systemic gender inequalities. They're more likely to have lost their job. They are more likely to work in close contact with infectious diseases. They have more childcare responsibilities. They have more housework to do. And they're far more likely to suffer from domestic and technology facilitated abuse. Other groups, such as displaced people, people living in poverty, people with disabilities, those who identify as LGBTQ+, also have been made vulnerable by historical structural exclusion and oppression and exploitation. Racial inequalities have been exposed and exacerbated as well. Globally, we see that Black people are more likely to die than white people, as well as other people of colour as well. And this is not any kind of genetic disadvantage at play. This is a reflection of structural racism and inequalities in access to healthcare and in wealth. And of course, the crisis has made many of us think about what is going to happen next. What happens after a situation like this? Can we understand it as a portal to a better future, as the novelist Arundhati Roy recently wrote in the Financial Times? And the optimist in me wants to say that we can, but I also think that in order to build a better future, we really have to attend to the present and the past, because historical inequalities are part of the reason why we are where we are. So already, this is quite a lot to contend with, but there's more. There's also many ways that the internet and its underlying algorithmic systems and structures and processes also amplify the same kinds of inequalities being exposed by the pandemic. The technology sector is still dominated by white men, and it's still not inclusive for Black people and people of colour, or women, or other gender minorities. Online abuse disproportionately impacts women, and particularly Black women and other women of colour and trans women. Algorithmic bias discriminates against women and people of colour in criminal justice, in recruitment, in facial recognition, and in many other spheres of life and other sectors. We face a huge gender data gap. This is Caroline Criado Perez's term to describe how the majority of data that designers and technologists use is based on the male body and life patterns. The Internet of Things is facilitating coercion and control of women in domestic settings. And we still have women with less access to the internet than men. So according to the Webb Foundation, men remain 21% more likely to be online, and this rises to up to 52% in the world's least developed countries. So obviously there is no shortage of problems to address, but rather than be defeated, we at Feminist Internet and our broader community, we want to take these challenges on together, and we want to use our grounding in intersectional feminism and creative practice to try to tackle them. So our motto at Feminist Internet is: there is no feminism, only possible feminisms. There is no internet, only possible internets. Possible feminisms are, for me, manifestations of the fight for gender equity and social justice that kind of respond to and morph in reaction to social and cultural shifts and changes. And they're possible because there isn't one way to enact them. And they're also possible because what the feminist cause looks like really depends on who you are and where you are and what other struggles you face. Possible internets invoke the futures that you've been talking about at this conference, and holds on to the notion that we can, in fact, shape the technologies that we interact with, even if it's only in small incremental ways. Feminist theories of technology, sometimes referred to as techno-feminism or cyberfeminism, historically explored the ways that gender shapes technology and technology shapes gender. If you want to dive into this, I would really recommend the Cyber Feminism Index, which was created by Mindy Sue, and you can access it at this URL. But there's also loads of really great accessible reading and scholarship around these issues, but that also attends to equity, not only in terms of gender, but also the way that gender intersects with issues of race, class, gender identity, for example. And if you're interested in exploring that, I recommend all of the books that you can see on this slide. They are all listed on the reading list for the MA in Internet Equalities, which I had the honour of creating for the Creative Computing Institute. So you can also go and check them out there. In terms of the design field, it's really worth knowing about feminist human-computer interaction and a paper in 2010 written by Shawan Bardzell, which outlined an agenda for feminist HCI, which she describes as the design and evaluation of interactive systems that are imbued with sensitivity to the central commitments of feminism: agency, fulfillment, identity in the self, equity, empowerment, diversity, and social justice. And Bardzell saw feminism as a natural ally to design because it makes visible the ways in which gender is constructed in everyday life, and then it generates opportunities for intervention. So out of this kind of field or tradition, we have developed a feminist design tool. This was also inspired by Josie Young, who is a feminist AI researcher and now a program manager in Microsoft's Ethics and Society team. So in 2017, Josie created a feminist chatbot design process, and that aimed to help chatbot design teams around the world to avoid perpetuating bias in their work. And we saw it and loved it, and we adapted it, and we gave it a kind of graphic design treatment as well to make it really super accessible. And then we've been revising it with Josie to arrive at what it is today. It's got 8 sections. Each has prompt questions for design teams that roughly correspond to a design process. So it starts off looking at who is something being designed for what purpose, in what context is it being made? And it encourages teams to do reflective work around their own team biases as well. It then goes on to focus on how a design itself might reinforce stereotypes, whether that's visually or through the language that it uses. And then it looks at data and the architectures that potentially underpin technologies. So to give some examples of where we've used it, in 2018, we were offered a fellowship at the Creative Computing Institute in London, and we really wanted to respond to the broader contextual issue of the problematic gendering of personal intelligent assistants like Alexa, Siri, and Cortana. Characterizing those types of devices as female by default obviously reinforces gender stereotypes about women and their roles in society, but also those devices weren't programmed adequately to respond to abuse, which they receive a lot, partly again because of the ways that they are gendered. So we designed a program which consisted of a seminar series and then 2 3-day workshops where students were invited to imagine what a feminist Alexa might be. And we weren't really trying to put a feminist sticking plaster over an Amazon product. I want to be really clear about that. We were using the term Alexa as a proxy to describe voice interfaces and what they could potentially be. So when we were designing these workshops, we mapped each section of the tool to each day of the workshop so that participants had something to really anchor their design process to, and also a way of articulating where they had made feminist decisions in their design process. So students came up with 8 fantastic prototypes for voice assistants, including Boo, which helps teenagers with embarrassing body problems, and Panny, which tackles loneliness amongst the elderly. And you can watch a video of all of those prototypes at the URL that you can see on this slide. We also use the tool in a 5-day intensive course about how to build a feminist chatbot. And the focus for this particular course was on tackling online abuse, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a huge barrier to internet equality. And our approach here was really to front load the workshop heavily with insights from activists and researchers that knew a lot about the problem itself. And I think this is really essential because often in the sort of sprint context, there isn't a lot of time for in-depth research. I also see this as an important part of the feminist approach, that we try to build on the existing work of others and acknowledge that work rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So here are some of the outcomes of that workshop. You can see there Ms. Leaky Pipes, which is a sex-positive flamingo that gives young women advice and guidance on how to safely send nude pictures. And you can also see Isla, which informs young women about online abuse. Finally, we really wanted to do something about the problem of AI bias. So we created FXer, which is a feminist guide to AI bias in the form of a chatbot. It was created in collaboration with Community Labs, and it's got 3 sort of conversational pathways that deal with bias in recruitment algorithms, in voice assistants, and in search engines. And the tool really helped us to think through the language used in the chatbot as well as its visual appearance. And it also prompted us to try to write the whole script of the chatbot without using the word I. And that was because it encourages people to think about the kinds of emotional attachments that they might be creating between technologies and the users of those technologies. But we are obviously not the only people or the only group that are working in this space. And so before I wrap up, I really wanted to share some other projects that I would recommend that you check out. So the Oracle for Transfeminist Technologies, this is a project from Coding Rights and the MIT Co-Design Studio, and it's led by Joanna Varon and Sasha Costanza-Chock, and it's illustrated by Clara Giuliano. And it's like a virtual and physical card game that's designed to help people collectively envision and prototype and share alternate imaginaries of futuristic technologies. Feminist AI does community-based educational work around reimagining alternative AI technologies, and their ENCODE project is centered around the ideas and values found in the book Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Imogen-Noble, which is amazing and I strongly recommend. They currently have a GoFundMe, so if you want to support the feminist cause, please do check that out. Next up is the open source Afro Hair Library by AM Dark. And this is a free 3D model database of Black hairstyles and textures. It was made in the context of very persistent, derogatory media stereotyping of Black people and of natural Black hair being considered a liability in both academia and in industry. And this is a really brilliant feminist, anti-racist resource for digital artists and 3D content creators that helps diversify both who is represented in and who produces media. Data Feminism is a fantastic book and project led by Catherine D'Ignacio and Lauren F. Klein. There is a lab at MIT that's exploring the way that data science and ethics could be re-informed by the ideas of intersectional feminism. And finally, Caroline Zinder's feminist dataset, which imagines data creation and use as a form of protest. So it explores all aspects of the AI process, including data collection, labeling, training, and model, all through an intersectional feminist lens. So obviously no one approach is going to solve all the problems that we're facing. And I know that some are hostile to the idea of feminism and, let alone willing to build it into their business strategies or government strategies. But I have seen people's mindsets shifting after engaging with our work and with the work of others. And I do believe that feminist approaches can help bring about more equitable futures because they centre gender equality and social justice. And in the process of rebuilding society after this pandemic or during this pandemic, I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. They also encourage us to design with and not for communities, and they encourage us to include voices way beyond our own. So just one final plug, if you will. If you're interested in this subject and you would like to study it in more depth, I would really encourage you to check out the MA Internet Equalities, which is going to be launching at the Creative Computing Institute next autumn. You're very welcome to contact me about that if you have any questions. But it is, I think, the first of its kind, and I think it has a lot of potential to help us create a wave of ethically engaged technologists. So thank you very, very much for watching, and thank you for listening. And if you want to support Feminist Internet, please follow us on social media or check out our magazine on Medium, which is called The Recode. And that's it, and I'll see you on the internet. Thank you so much.
Hi, Charlotte. Hello.
Hi.
It's nice to see you in color now, though your black and white version with the animation was also spellbinding, and I really like that format. These are some of the joys of online events that we don't really get to experience in physical ones.
Right, exactly. Well, I was going to say thank you so much to Marta for doing those illustrations. It was wonderful.
I should mention immediately that there is a slight lag in the tool we're using, which I think means we're like people talking between Earth and the moon or to different planets. So bear with us, please. Charlotte, I wanted to start. I think we live in a time when there's quite a lot of critique of the internet, though admittedly there's also a lot of people still who are uncritical of it. But so your Feminist Internet project is critical of the internet. We'll come later to a point where it'll also be about positive change. But for now, let's focus on the criticism. There are many theories what's wrong with the internet. I'm curious, when do you think the internet broke? And how did it happen? What's your take?
Oh, that's a wonderful question to start with. Thank you. Well, there's no internet, but only possible internets, right? So I don't think there's one history of the way that a perfect internet was broken, if you like. I think it's probably more of a question of many, many fractures that are happening in different contexts and different locations. I'm always wary of sort of grand narratives or singular narratives. So, I mean, I think we see certainly critiques of the commodification of social media and so on, which do make a lot of sense. And I think if you want to read a really good account from a sort of Western perspective of the demise of the internet, then Lurking by Joanne McNeill is a really, really good book to have a look at, because it's a sort of first-hand account of her experience of seeing the commodification of social media. But I guess I would also say, what does it mean for the internet to break in different contexts, right? So, for example, an internet shutdown under an authoritarian regime would be a different kind of breakage to the kind of fragmentation and breakage that we see with increased commodification or surveillance or privacy breaches or something like that. So I think trying to think about it from a global perspective is really helpful. I guess also there's something about the idea of design decisions that were made that had unintended consequences that kind of really troubles me, because I think we might be reaching a stage where it's much more difficult to claim that you couldn't foresee something that would happen with a technology that you created, right? But you can see these small changes that lead to negative development. So, for example, like the YouTube recommendation feature, I think is a really good example of this, because what we saw with YouTube in, I think it was 2012, when they started to kind of optimize their algorithm for by time. So the company had a goal to make people stay and watch videos for like 1 billion hours a day, something like that. So the nature of the content that was being created on YouTube changed because the algorithm was favoring longer form content. They also added this recommendation feature. And by the way, there's a very good episode of Reply All that goes into this in detail. So check that out if you want to. And when they added the recommendation feature, they would typically recommend something that would autoplay after you'd watched an algorithm. But that would be more general content being recommended. And it led to this thing called the Gangnam Style problem at YouTube, which basically meant that all roads led to the Gangnam Style video because it was the most popular video on YouTube. So then they changed the algorithm again to kind of solve this problem. And they changed it so that what you would be recommended after you saw a piece of video content would be a bit more niche, a bit more specialized, rather than more general and more popular. And the unforeseen consequences of this was that more extremist content got prioritized on YouTube because, for example, if you took, I don't know, you watched something about affirmative action, a few recommendations later, you might see something on eugenics. And obviously, the YouTube recommendation feature is not what broke the internet, right? But it's an example of one of many, many fractures and breakages that altogether contribute to, an internet that we didn't want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is interesting. I understand you're saying that this is a kill by 1,000 blows, so to say, right?
Right.
That I understand that you could tell many different stories, like the one about the YouTube algorithm, and they all have some structural similarities, but concern different moments at which different people and companies and organizations can make a decision that goes in one direction other. But I think it's important that you mentioned that you personally don't like the grand vision, because I think it might be a bit of a stereotype, but still, I think technologies are often built by people who do like grand visions and don't like little things that stop them, like, impact assessment or ethical review or just thinking through possible consequences. And I think that's the challenge with the internet, that it's a formula we discover that really scales, right? That's basically I think the basic promise of the internet, right? No matter what you design, I'm not gonna judge you, the internet. I'm just gonna let you get on the net and scale if you manage to grasp people's, emotions, addictions, whatever. But
Right.
so, go ahead.
Well, no, exactly. And that's why I'm sort of so concerned about the idea of, runaway consequences that couldn't have been foreseen, because I think we need to be much more accountable when we are building technologies and do the impact assessments and do the, risk modeling and stuff like that, because, we can't just put it down to, well, things scale and then it's out of our hands because, it runs away.
Yeah. And in this sense, I think what's for me important, because you mentioned it in your talk, right? That you have a feminist perspective that is about gender and technology, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I find it important that when you present that definition, there are actually many other values there, and values that I think are very important today when we think what we want technology to do. And actually, I often think values that were a bit missed in some of the design decisions. And obviously the key one is equality. I think in theory one could say, oh, we've always thought about equality. We always wanted to get away, solve the problem of the digital divide, right? It's about equal access. But I imagine you would say that's not enough, that we need more equality than just equality and access to technology, right?
Well, I think the issue of the digital divide is certainly about sort of digital infrastructure and access to networks and whether the networks in your region actually work and can function properly. But it's also about, digital skills. The Webb Foundation's recent report on closing the digital divide is the document to read about this topic. But, it talks about how I can't remember the percentage, but it's a high percentage of women who say that a lack of digital skill is the thing that prevents them from accessing the internet. And we need to make sure that not only are the infrastructures there, but those skills, and also we need to make sure it's safe when people get there, right? So if you're going to close the digital divide, we need to make sure that the internet is safer for women, especially young women. Well, actually, no, just all women and all people. So I think it's a multifaceted issue, the access issue and the digital divide issue.
I think that's the sort of big mental shift that projects like yours try to cause. That for a long time people thought the issue is that you don't have access to the technology, and you're showing very well that also the technology itself, for those who do have access, raises a lot of forms of inequality. And this, and that you need to start dealing with these forms of inequality. The work is not solved, the moment you give someone a computer, or maybe even give that person skills, because they can, for instance, be still, technology can be biased. I think that's a key term that appears in your talk. So I wanted to ask you about a bit more specifically about one project, because I like it a lot. And I think it also illustrates well your approach. So I chose the Feminist Alexa. And I just thought maybe it's good to explain to the viewers. So why did you choose what's important about intelligent assistants and also chatbots? Why did you pick this technology to work with?
Yeah, so there was rising attention and critique around the ways that devices like Alexa and Siri and Cortana were by default gendered as female. And that critique had two main parts. The first was that, as I mentioned, characterizing the devices themselves as female sort of reinforces, well, gender binaries, first of all, but also it reinforces kind of normative thinking about the roles of women who are characterized as being responsible for sort of service work, for care work, for domestic work. And then the other part of the critique was around the way that those devices were inadequately programmed to respond to abuse. And it's really important to say that because they receive a lot of abuse, like, gendered insults, sexual gendered insults. And that happens partly because these devices are female. One thing that's really important to say is that part of the critique, if we're not careful, it could trivialize abuse that's received on the bodies of human women. And that's an important consideration to take into account. And we're absolutely not saying that abuse received by a device is anything like abuse received by real people. So that's just something to make really clear. But that's why we chose to do it. And actually, after we'd done the workshops, a report came out from UNESCO called I'd Blush If I Could, which talked about this exact issue. The title was because originally Siri, when you told her, you're a bitch, it responded, I'd blush if I could, which is obviously a coy, flirtatious remark, which is absolutely unacceptable in teaching people about appropriate language, about consent. And Apple has now reprogrammed the response to, I think it now says, I don't understand what you said, or something like that. So that was the context, and that's why we decided to do it. But also, I think there's a huge amount of potential creatively in voice technologies, in the voice, and so we're really interested to see what students would come up with if we introduce this problem through that medium.
And by the way, also these voice technologies and the whole audio sphere is also very interesting for the Digital Cultures Festival we're talking at. So that's a great connection. But so is that, so you're telling us stories that we can empower basically people to understand better technologies and to even have a sense that they can design them, right? And this is, I really like, I know that you're even thinking like how to then go on to create courses so that young people can, for instance, build Alexa skills that are maybe a bit more empowering than the corporate selection that you can get, in the Alexa store. But this is, I wanted to ask you, and I know you said you sort of don't like the grand visions, but don't you feel a bit, I don't know how to say it, but so in the end, is that good enough that Apple fixed that dialogue, right? And I know there are multiple stories like that. There's the Microsoft chatbot Tay that went online on Twitter and learned to be a Nazi in a day, and they took it off. And apparently the company actually did fix it and did the whole process to learn how to do things differently, how to be smarter. But nevertheless, they first launched the technology in a reckless way, right? And similarly here, it's sort of mind-blowing to hear you have a huge company that's known for designing its plastic basically to the tiniest detail so that it's perfect, but they cannot get right a response to a sexist, basically completely improper remark. Does it feel good that it gets fixed, or we need more than that?
No, I mean, I don't think it's good enough at all. And this is, I guess we're going back a little bit to the earlier point about it's not okay to not think these things through in the first place. Yes, I'm glad that they modified that, but they should have thought about it in the first place, right? And I don't know if you've been following the story about the deep fake bot that's been producing deep fake images of undressed women on Telegram. And what's behind that story is somebody releasing this deep fake AI on the internet, and then within, I think, a few days or so, removing it because they suddenly realized how problematic this could be and what the risk would be if the technology misused. Well, I think if you realize 24 hours after something's been launched that it's going to be extremely harmful for women, you should have been able to see that 24 hours earlier, right? And I think it's time to stop this idea that you can't foresee the consequences, because you absolutely can. And unfortunately, the reason why that spread so quickly was because the code was then out there and it was replicated and it was used. And now this bot is one of the simplest ways for people who have no knowledge or expertise in AI to be able to create these really harmful, abusive images of women.
Yeah, it's I do a lot of work around this metaphor of open, which for a long time we've seen as this very empowering idea. Let's make things open, right? And I think it's also dawning on the open community, which I think has very, very sort of good ethics, right? But also is only starting to deal with understanding the unintended consequences, with the negative externalities, that it's not just so rosy that, access and right to use and possibility to use and skills will just create a better world. And I think that's, for me, really the challenge we're dealing with. So I wonder, because you often say you're an optimist, do you see any shift happening among these big players who in the end shape the technologies? Because, I could say, okay, so you have your feminist Alexa project, it has some reach, but in the end there is the Alexa, and it reaches millions, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it passed the billion mark. Are these people behind the really big technologies shifting because of projects like yours, or we need to wait a bit longer to really see change?
I would love to be able to say that because of our project, they're going to change their ways, but I think that's unrealistic, actually. And I do see more and more attention on issues of ethics and AI bias. And I think they're much more firmly embedded into not only the industry, but also the public psyche. And I think that's a really good thing. I was looking recently at Microsoft's new responsible innovation toolkit, which is quite interesting because it's actually sort of reminiscent of speculative design in some ways. It's got a game called Judgment Call, and it allows people to create product reviews of technologies that don't exist yet in order to help them sort of predict that any harms that might come from them being created. And it's also got a harms modeling section. And I find that quite striking because it's not a million miles away from speculative design projects that might use more imaginative approaches or games or something like that to think through unintended consequences of technologies, right? But I don't think that those efforts in certain departments of major technological corporations mean that the systemic problems of those corporations are going away. I mean, the extraordinary rise of Amazon through the pandemic, I think, and the continued sort of worker protests that we see in the technology industry make it clear that this is not an environment which is fair for workers, and it's certainly still obviously profit driven. And I think that it's going to take an awful long time for us to reach parity in the sector and therefore have a better and fairer sort of techno-social situation. But I don't know, what do you think? Have you seen any changes yourself in the sector that you're working in around the commons? Do you think things are improving?
Yeah, yes, I do see changes, but they are slow. And so one way for me to deal with this is to think that we're all playing a very long-term game. And for instance, when I see the attention you pay to making your approach more accessible, to training people, the fact that you launch a course, I think that's the way to go. Maybe that's unfortunate, right? We'd all probably like things to fix quickly, and even more importantly, they should be fixed quickly, but maybe that's not how the world works. So that's my approach, and I like this thinking, that optimism is not naivety, but it's more about faith that things can be better. It's sort of kind of not rational. It's just it's a life, maybe not lifestyle, but a worldview. That's how I try to approach it, because otherwise I think it would be very hard to do these positive projects. I think I would need to focus on just being very critical of technology, which brings me sort of to the last point of our conversation. I wanted to ask you a bit about design, because I think working with design is a way, obviously, of making things and not just being critical. You use a very specific form of design called speculative design. Can you say a bit how that works and what are the advantages of that as a tool for change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the idea of imagining future possibilities can be very productive, because it allows you to think about not only sort of potential better scenarios than what we've got now. I don't like to say utopia, but better. But it also, of course, allows you to imagine potential negative futures, harms, unintended consequences, etc., as we see with the tools that Microsoft have just released. And so I think it's got that sort of dual function, thinking through what might happen, thinking through what would be amazing to happen. I think one thing that's really important to say about any kind of speculation is don't do it unless it's grounded in some kind of research or some kind of interaction with the communities that you're thinking about designing with, hopefully. It's not a substitute for good user research and good sort of stakeholder consultation and things like that. It's much more about a creative tool that needs to be robustly tested in real life scenarios. We actually just ran a really fun workshop with young activists where we created a sort of speculative scenario where it's 2050 and the internet's no longer the internet, but it's the feminist internet. And we asked them to create a conversation between the feminist internet as an entity and a sort of alien life form, and try to explain to the alien life form how online abuse ended. And what was really amazing was, because it was a relatively creative, open space, they were able to come up with ideas that genuinely seemed just came up with really, really good ideas. I don't think that they would have come up with if it had been a more straightforward, I don't know, questionnaire, for example, about how they felt about the problem itself, but allowing them to work together and be really, really generative and think about what this unexpected future conversation was actually very generative. And I mean, it's not the case that ideas that come up in contexts like that are necessarily always implementable, but sometimes they are. Sometimes things that don't seem implementable might be the best ideas, right? So I think that's its potential.
It also sounds to me you're sort of, well, okay, the thought I had is that these are also ideas that some of the basically dudes that designed the internet and the tech bros wouldn't have because they're using the wrong methods. And that's what I think design is very powerful in Poland. In recent years, I see a lot of sort of excitement caused by some design projects in a way that I think other forms of practice, like science, for instance, never would achieve that goal. But I think what's really powerful about it is that it can create empathy and then understanding that things can look differently, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I'd love to know if you think that speculative design processes can advance the area of work that you're in. Could they help people understand and engage with the commons more?
You know, the interesting thing is that I recently realized that in Polish, the plural form of the future sounds very weird, and basically beyond the expression alternative futures, which also not too many people probably talk about, it's a very weird thing to say. And I know in English, the term futures, it's hard for me to judge whether it's an unusual one or by now accepted. But for me, it just shows, you know, with what level of challenges we are starting from in a country like ours, at least, but I think all around the world, this idea that you can imagine futures and not just one future, technologies, not technology, is a very strong idea. So we will be slowly wrapping up. If there's any, you know, final thought you have about our conversation, please go ahead. I have one more question for you. Otherwise,
Okay,
should I
go
go
ahead.
with it? So, do you think artificial intelligence has a gender?
No, I don't think artificial intelligence has a gender. I think that artificial intelligence is often encoded into systems which reinforce existing gender stereotypes. So the technologies themselves don't have a gender, but of course the context in which they're built is gendered. So that codifying is built into the systems. If that makes sense.
It does, yes. I also agree it does not have, but I think it's sometimes presented, not just in technologies, but also in conversations, you know, in subtle ways as being gendered.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there was a panel about this, right, with Anna, where, you know, the issue of the characterization of AI as sort of sexy and female in media and cinema, that's an historical phenomenon, right? And that's part of the trajectory of the codifying of personal intelligent assistants as female as well. And the fact is that it's not a given necessity. They don't have to be envisaged that way. They could be envisaged in any way whatsoever. The reason why they get created like that is because market preferences wants to have calm, caring female voices so that the technology companies can make more money from the products that they want to sell, right? But that isn't a predetermined need. So we can use technologies, we can use AI to challenge these ideas about gender, to break down gender binaries, rather than keep on reinforcing these outdated notions of, male and female.
Yeah. Yeah, I asked you this because we sort of started with the internet, which I think was, doesn't have it's a technology, and your critique of it is very interesting. But now in this new, sometimes people say artificial intelligence era, I think the issues you're dealing with at Feminist Internet are even more significant. That's because this technology is often portrayed as gender. Then there's this stereotype of the female voice in your phone, right? That's why I find your work so very important. Charlotte, so thank you very much. We're out of time, unfortunately. I think we could go on and talk for another hour at least, but this has probably been a long day also for people participating in the festival, so it's time to thank you.
Thank you so much.
And also say goodbye to everyone. I understand this is one of the final sessions of the festival. Oh, I was just told by a voice in my ear that there is a question from the audience, so we're actually going to stop with the goodbyes, and maybe I can quickly ask you. So, what ways would you see of involving people in this movement, people who haven't ever considered themselves as feminists, or even people who might be part of the current problems that you outline?
Yeah, so there's got to be a sort of multifaceted strategy here, because obviously people are coming from different contexts, they're at different stages in their career, they're coming from different disciplinary backgrounds. So it really sort of depends. But I think when we're trying to engage companies, for example, we do try to, I guess, modify our language and our framing slightly so that we're able to engage with people without creating too many barriers. Because as I said in the presentation, sometimes the concept of feminism can create some skepticism, and I think it's good to be quite agile in the way that you communicate with people depending on where they're at. And as Alex said, there's lots of principles here that are straightforwardly social justice principles. So if you need to sort of modify, it's okay to do that. In other contexts where we're engaging with students, for example, I think it's really important to explain what we mean by feminisms and explain that this isn't something that is only for women, for example, and explain the sort of intersectional nature of the feminism that we are grounded in. So explain that it's a way of us approaching not only issues of gender, but also race, class, belief, ability, and so on. So I guess trying to break down some of the preconceptions about what feminism might be is really helpful. And then also I think making content accessible in different spaces as well. So for example, recently I was able to develop a course for a platform called FutureLearn on designing feminist chatbots. And that's a free open course, that anybody from anywhere in the world can join, and many people have. And that's been a really good way to engage a much wider audience than we already would. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, indeed. Maybe I can say at the end that I'm a proud father of 2 daughters, and I often think as my work, and we talked that it's often work done in a long perspective. I keep in mind, for instance, where the world will be when they are 18 and what technologies they will face, and I can just wish that by that point, really we can all sign up under the idea of feminist internet, and there won't be any need to think that maybe you don't need to use that term, because I think it's a very, very good term that basically in a concise way defines a lot of crucial values that we need to build into technology. Charlotte, thank you once again. This is
Thank you
our
so
final
much.
thank you and goodbye. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.